This war was brought to an end through a treaty, the Treaty of Westphalia. Very good. The Treaty of Westphalia brought this war to an end. We'll discuss this treaty more elaborately when we discuss international relations, because it was this treaty which actually led to the birth of the modern nation state. Okay, so we had Renaissance and then we had Reformation, and of course, as I told you, these changes that took place in Europe led to the first industrial revolution. We discussed that, isn't it? The first industrial revolution. Please remember that the industrial revolution for the first time began in England, and later it spread to other countries. Industrial revolution, any revolution is, can you tell me what is the meaning of revolution? How do you understand the word revolution?
Sudden change.
A sudden change, a change from the roots, a radical change. That is, a change that occurs from the roots is called as a revolution. We had Green Revolution, isn't it? Green Revolution. Till then in India, we practiced agriculture that was subsistence agriculture. Okay? But suddenly, we wanted to practice intensive agriculture, which actually means a change from the roots in agricultural practices in India. And that's the reason why we call that as Green Revolution. So, the term revolution signifies any change that occurs from the roots. Okay? Now, here we are speaking about what's called as industrial revolution. Now, industrial revolution is a revolution in the way people have begun to produce goods. Okay? Please remember that before the first industrial revolution that took place in Europe, goods were not produced in the form of mass production. Goods were manually produced. They were handicraftsmen who produced goods in very small quantities. But now, the first industrial revolution led to what's called as mechanized production. So, machines began to be employed for production of goods, large scale. So, a sudden shift in the way the production of goods had taken place. Are you with me? This is what's called as the first industrial revolution. So, the first industrial revolution was made possible because of the age of Enlightenment, the discoveries, rationalism, exercise of reason by people, adoption of scientific principles, development of technology. All this happened, all this happened in Europe, and that led to the first industrial revolution. Okay, so we are looking at the progression of how the societies had evolved, isn't it? We spoke about the age of classical antiquity, the ancient Greek period. We spoke about the medieval period, which was called as Christendom, where men had absolutely no freedoms. We spoke about the modern age, dawned because of the advent of the age of Enlightenment, where people began to question religion. People began to stop adopting blind approach towards religion. People began to question religion. The age of Enlightenment, if you remember, I told you yesterday, was emphasizing on rationality. It was emphasizing on humanism. It was emphasizing on what was very famously called as naturalism. Naturalism. These were some very important principles that were proposed by, the age of Enlightenment. What do you mean by naturalism? And this is a belief that the nature has its own order. Nature has its own order. Earlier, in the entire medieval period, people began to believe in religion. People began to believe that God had created this universe. God had created the earth, God had created Adam, Eve and all this, isn't it? So, the entire universe was a creation of God. Now, that was how it was believed earlier, isn't it? But now, people began to believe that there is a natural order in the universe. For example, we had Isaac Newton, who proposed his theory of gravity, when he said the entire universe is operating on a principle of gravity. The simple statement given by Newton that in this universe, every body attracts every other body. The force of attraction is directly proportional to the masses and inversely proportional to the distance between the bodies. Newton's law of gravity is this, very simple. Every body in this universe attracts every other body. The force of attraction is directly proportional to the mass of the bodies and inversely proportional to the distance between them. This was the theory put forward by Newton. It was this simple statement given by Newton which actually explains every astronomical phenomenon. Why is there a sun? Why are the planets revolving around the sun? What is the Big Bang theory? Why did the Big Bang actually occur? Why is the universe expanding? Why are all these heavenly bodies in a state of equilibrium? Every astronomical and physical phenomena was explained by the statement given by Newton. So people began to believe that nature has its own order. There are certain laws through which we can understand nature. This is what's called as naturalism. So till then, people believed whatever the religion said. God created the universe, God created Adam, God created Eve, whatever the religion claimed, people believed that. But now, in the age of enlightenment, people began to question religion and people began to understand the world in a much better way. Several physicists, several zoologists, several geologists, historians, all of them have put forth their own ideas. Right? There was a person called Descartes in France who proposed rationality. There was Isaac Newton who said that nature has its own order. There are certain laws through which we can understand the nature. We can understand the universe. We can understand the astronomical phenomena. There were a lot of scientists who contributed to this age of enlightenment. God did not create man and woman. Men evolved from apes. There was this Charles Darwin who said that God did not create Adam and Eve. Human beings evolved from apes. Darwinian theory of evolution, isn't it? So religion began to be questioned in this age. This was the modern age. I told you, the age of enlightenment, it led to a movement, a religious movement called Protestant movement, which led to the reformation of religion, reformation. Different viewpoints are being put forward now. And all this happened, as I told you, if you remember in the last class, because of the birth of a new ideology called liberalism, isn't it? Liberalism, which proposed individual should be free. Individual should be at liberty. We also discussed in the last class that liberalism as an ideology supported democracy. It supported secularism. It supported, yes, capitalism. Individuals should be free. All these new concepts, new ideas, they were given a new thrust because of a new ideology called liberalism. This was an ideology which gave a spurt to these ideas. Okay, democracy, secularism, capitalism. I told you yesterday that all these became a part of liberal Western values. They became a part of liberal Western civilization. Today, when in the Western countries, people say that there are certain values which we hold very dear to our heart. It is these very values that they are speaking about. Okay? Whenever they claim that we should have human rights, whenever they claim that the government should be accountable, whenever they claim that people should have right to information, all this is predominantly an outcome of these very values. Now, these values were proposed by a new ideology called liberalism. We discussed that yesterday. Okay? Now you understand what is democracy. People will, choose their leaders. People will choose the agendas. People will hold the government accountable. People will criticize the government. People will exercise political rights. There will be freedom of press. That is democracy. We understand what is secularism now. Secularism means what? The state will not have any official religion. The state will not discriminate between religions. All the people will have equal religious rights. People's religion and religious practices will not be interfered with by the state. Secularism. The state will not interfere in religious practices and religious choices of individuals. And that's called as secularism. What is capitalism? Capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system, isn't it? Can you tell me what comes to your mind when you hear the word capitalism? What do you understand by capitalism? Capitalism.
Individuals have freedom to acquire economic property.
Individuals have freedom to acquire property. Antena? Yeah, you're right. You're right to some extent. Please remember that there are two fundamental economic systems. One is called as capitalism. We'll discuss all these later as a part of our syllabus. I'm just trying to introduce these terms to you. As a part of trying to understand how the society had evolved, I'm introducing these terms to you and I'm trying to help you understand these terms better. Ante. Not more than that. We'll have to anyway look at these terms very deeply as a part of our syllabus. But just get to know what they are, what they mean. Get some what's called as bird's eye view on these basic ideas. Now, capitalism is a type of economic system. Across the entire world, there are various types of economic systems. There are countries which have adopted capitalism. There are countries which have adopted an opposite of capitalism. What is that? Socialism. Okay. There are even other types of economic systems also. For example, India had adopted a mixed economy, a mixture of capitalism and socialism. Okay. So there are different types of economic systems which are adopted by countries. But very broadly, we can divide the economic systems into capitalism and socialism based on the ownership of the means of production. That is the fundamental basis, depending on which we categorize the economic systems into capitalism and socialism. Okay, based on the ownership of the means of production. You know what are the means of production? What do you mean by means of production? Means of production. In economy, you call them as factors of production. Yeah. What exactly are these? These are the inputs that you require to produce something. To produce something, you require land, you require capital, you require labor, you require an organization. So all the inputs that you require to produce something are called as factors of production. Okay, factors of production. And you know that in economy, you call them as factors of production. They're also called as means of production. Things that you require to produce something are called as means of production. Isn't it? You require land, you require labor, you require capital, and you require organization. These are the four means of production. Okay? Who controls and who owns these means of production is the basis for dividing the economic systems into capitalism and socialism. If these means of production are owned and controlled by private individuals, you call that as capitalism. Under capitalism, these means of production are owned and controlled by private individuals. That's called as capitalism. If these means of production are collectively owned by the entire society, if the means of production are collectively owned by the entire society and are controlled by the state and controlled by the government, state, we call that as socialism. Followed? Okay? So all these factors of production, things that you require to produce, goods and services. For example, this is an organization, isn't it? What are we producing here? Are we producing something in this organization called Sarat Chandra IAS Academy? Are we producing something here? Yeah? Are we manufacturing something here? Are we producing something here? what are the things which are produced in an economy? In an economy, goods and services are produced. So what are we producing here? We're producing a service. A service called education is being produced here. Right? So for producing this service or for producing a good, what do you require? You require land first. You require a place where you produce it. You require people, labor, people like us who teach in this organization, labor. You require somebody to invest. And you require this organization called the academy, isn't it? So the 4 factors of production, if they are privately owned, we call that as capitalism. And if they are collectively owned by the society, and if they are controlled by the state, we call that as socialism. Understand this? So under capitalism, the means of production are under private ownership, under private control. First, it means capitalism recognizes individuals' right to acquire and possess property. Isn't it? It recognizes individuals' right to acquire property. In socialism, all the property will be collectively owned. Nobody will have any private right of ownership to anything which is called wealth. Everything will be collectively owned under conditions of socialism. Under conditions of capitalism, all these are privately owned and privately controlled. This is called as capitalism. So whenever you come across the word capitalism, first understand that, oh, this is an economic system in which the means of production are privately owned and controlled. Land is privately owned. Even labor, for example, I am working here. This organization owns my labor. Privately owned, privately controlled. This is capitalism. So under conditions of capitalism, it is private ownership. 2, the economic system recognizes right to property. In this economic system, the state or government will play a very, very less role. State role is minimum. State role is minimum. So we have a minimum state. State role is minimum. In this type of the economic system, the state role is very, very minimum. Got it? Right. The state will not interfere in economic activities. State will not interfere in economic activities. Okay. This type of economic system is based on the principle of competition. Okay. So there is a market. In market, there are a lot of organizations. The organizations compete among themselves. They produce the goods. They supply the goods. So there is this principle of competition. Okay? In capitalism, the economic decisions are not taken by the state. The economic decisions are taken by private individuals based on what is called market forces. Market forces, Can you tell me who was the person who said that under conditions of capitalism, the invisible forces of market determine all economic solutions? The invisible forces of market. There are 2 forces of market. Demand, supply. The demand and supply are invisible forces of market. So every private individual, every organization, every enterprise which wants to take a decision will take a decision based on demand and supply. For example, today in Hyderabad, there is a demand for coaching. Therefore, a lot of individuals have now invested money in setting up coaching institutes. Okay. So demand had determined an economic decision. Followed me, right? So what should be the price that an organization should quote for offering coaching? That depends on the demand. That depends on the demand in the market. Okay. So if there are a lot of institutions Every organization will compete with the other organization. Ante kada? Every organization will compete with the other organization. So organizations will now propose several ways through which they make themselves competitive in the market. Okay, so some organizations will say we have the best faculty. Some organizations will say we have the best material. Some organizations will say we will offer you mentorship. Some organizations will say we will adopt the hand-holding approach. Hand-holding approach, it seems. Okay, so organizations will market. Organizations will become competitive. Organizations will quote their price based on the demand in the market. Followed me? It is these invisible forces of market called demand and supply which determine all economic answers, all economic questions. Followed me? Okay. So who or when I should invest? What should be the price that I should quote? How I should market? How I should reach out to the clients or customers? Everything will be based on demand and supply. Followed me? Please remember, no matter how much of economy you study, there are only 5 fundamental economic questions. What to produce, how to produce, how much to produce, when to produce, how to distribute. Only 5 economic questions. What to produce, how much to produce, when to produce, and how to distribute. All these 5 economic questions will be addressed by the invisible forces of market called demand and supply. The state should not interfere. Natural order. Even economy also will have its own natural order. It has its own order. People know what they want. They will put forward their demand. And companies know what to produce. They'll produce and they'll supply. They'll earn profits. The state should not interfere in economic activities. This is capitalism. The entire production is organized by private sector. The entire production is organized by the private sector. This is capitalism. Private individuals will own and control the means of production. Individuals' right to property will be recognized and protected. State's role is minimum in economic activities, and state will not try to control the economic activities of individuals. 4. The private sector is the major player in capitalism. It is the private sector which is the major producer of goods and services under conditions of capitalism. Under conditions of capitalism, we have the market forces of demand and supply determining all economic questions. All economic questions will be determined by the market forces of demand and supply. This is capitalism. Under conditions of capitalism, we have the principle of competition, which makes available the best goods and services to customers at the most competitive prices. So people will have good goods, availability of quality services at very, very competitive prices in capitalism. Companies will take rational decisions, will understand the market forces, they'll make investments and they'll supply, they'll earn their profits. The private sector, through their profits converted into investments, will create employment. So this is an order which will go on. The state need not interfere in this order. This is the period of Enlightenment. Naturalism. There is a natural order in the way economic activities will be organized. There should not be any interference in the natural flow of economics. Capitalism. This was proposed by the ideology called liberalism. Please remember that all these are interconnected. Followed me. All these are interconnected. You cannot make a distinction, or you cannot try to compartmentalize each of these. Each resulted in the other. Each influenced the other. The modern age was heralded by the age of Enlightenment. The age of Enlightenment led to Renaissance. People began to adopt reason, scientific principles. Renaissance led to reformation of religion. Protestant movement became very, very popular. And Protestant movement began to challenge the orthodoxy of church, Roman Catholic Church. And of course, it was during this time we saw the birth of a new ideology called liberalism. And it is this ideology which proposed individual freedom, individual liberty, and which emphasized on rights of individuals. Individuals should have their rights. Individuals require rights to lead a dignified life, a life of self-respect, a life of fulfillment. For these, individuals require rights. Can you tell me who was the person who proposed the idea of natural rights? John Locke. John Locke says that a person born a human being is born with rights endowed by nature. These are natural rights. Right to life, right to liberty, and right to estate, property. These are individuals' natural rights. Please remember, it is these ideas which forms the crux of the ideology called liberalism. The ideas expressed by Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Rousseau, J.S. Mill, Montesquieu, Machiavelli, Jeremy Bentham. All these were ideas proposed by a good number of political thinkers which forms the content of an ideology called liberalism. Followed me. So democracy, Thomas Hobbes speaks about democracy, John Locke speaks about democracy. Can you tell me who is the high priest of democracy? Rousseau. Very good. The person who proposed the idea of separation of religion from politics, Machiavelli, secularism. The person who proposed that the invisible forces of market called demand and supply should be the basis for all economic decisions. Who is this? The person who proposed that the invisible forces of market called demand and supply should determine all economic decisions. This was said by father of economics. Yes, if we establish an economic system like this, it will lead to the book that he wrote, Wealth of Nations. If we create an economic system like this, it will increase the wealth of nations. You know, the book written by Adam Smith was called Wealth of Nations. An inquiry into the wealth of nations. Wealth of Nations was a book written by Adam Smith. Okay, so all these ideas were popularized by a good number of thinkers. All these thinkers are belonging to this age of enlightenment. Okay, it is these thinkers who ushered the age of enlightenment, who ushered the modern era. Okay, now, so capitalism, as I told you, gave the society a new mode of production. It was this capitalism which, for the first time, liberated individuals' enterprising nature. It liberated individuals' enterprising nature. Now, individuals were free to take their economic decisions. Individuals were free to compete with each other. Individuals were free to invest, to use their intelligence, to use their innovation, ingenuity in pursuit of profits. So it was this ingenuity, human ingenuity, that was liberated by capitalism. Okay, so people now set to themselves the task of pursuing their self-interest, pursuing their profits, making money, earning wealth. You know, all this led to new trends and sweeping changes in society, which led to, as I told you, the first industrial revolution. All these forces were liberated, which led to the first industrial revolution. Till now, please remember, in the modern times, the humankind had experienced 4 industrial revolutions. 4 industrial revolutions. This was the first industrial revolution. Okay? The present industrial revolution that we are seeing, which is guided by artificial intelligence, is called as the 4th industrial revolution. This is called as the 4th industrial revolution. I told you, what's a revolution? A revolution is a fundamental change, a change from the roots. So what was the change that this industrial revolution had brought about? It introduced mechanized production. machine-based production. So production was for the first time organized in massive scale. Got it? So machines were introduced. New forms of fuel were introduced. Combustion engines were created. Huge factories were established. Steam energy was invented by whom? Steam engine was invented by James Watt. Okay? Suddenly somebody invents electricity. Suddenly somebody invents the structure or discovers the structure of atom. Charles Boyle gives his contribution to chemistry. Newton gives his contribution to physics and astronomy. Archimedes comes out with his principles. Suddenly the world is beginning to churn out new technologies, new inventions, scientific breakthroughs. That was the basis of the first industrial revolution. Mechanized production. New forms of fuel were introduced. Factory-based production was introduced. People began to acquire new skill sets. Till then, people were agricultural laborers or simple handicraftsmen using very simple tools. But now, people became factory workers. People were now part of huge assembly lines producing goods in masses. Mass production of goods began in Europe. This first industrial revolution, as I told you, gave mankind unprecedented growth. For the first time, mankind witnessed unprecedented growth. Growth that was never seen before. Suddenly, people had lots of goods. Standards of life were increasing. Longevity was increasing. People were now using technology, even in their daily affairs also. People were now having access to better quality goods at competitive prices. This was industrial revolution. As I told you, England was the epicenter of this industrial revolution. But very soon, other regions also caught up. Other regions in Europe also caught up. France, Portuguese, Germany, all these regions also caught up with this first industrial revolution. Okay? And it was this industrial revolution which gave Europe prosperity. Europe became very, very prosperous. From a very simple agrarian society, Europe became modern industrialized society. Huge industrial centers were created like Lancashire, Manchester, New Victoria. All these were huge industrial centers that were created in Europe. And these huge industrial centers began to produce goods, began to provide employment. It created new wage structures. Capitalism, as I told you, emerged as a boon to the mankind. Okay? That was how industrial revolution changed the society. People began to change, cultures began to change. So from practices of joint family, slowly migration of workers increased. Nuclear families came about. So people's ideas, thoughts, tastes, their modes of consumption also began to change very, very quickly. Regions were getting connected. Transport facilities were increasing. New machines were being created. Everything was changing very slowly. Industrial revolution. But please remember, for this industrial revolution to sustain itself, it requires one, continuous supply of raw materials, isn't it? Two, it requires markets for its finished products. The industries were producing, but the goods that were being produced by the industries required to be sold. Only if the goods are sold, the companies will make profits. And these profits will become investments for the companies to grow. And these investments will create new employment opportunities. Societies will grow. People's lives will improve, isn't it? But for this industrial revolution to survive and sustain, it requires continuous supply of raw materials and continuous supply of markets. It requires new market sources, isn't it? And therefore, this industrial revolution led to the age of discoveries. The age of discoveries. A lot of European countries, which are very, very rapidly industrializing, began explorations to find and discover new territories, new regions. Suddenly, one person across the Cape of Good Hope discovers a sea route to India. Who was that person who discovered the sea route to India? In the closing years of the 15th century. Yes? Vasco da Gama. He discovered the sea route to India. Why? Because the countries, it required raw materials. The search now was on for discovery of new lands. So new lands were being discovered. Voyages were being undertaken. Christopher Columbus, Copernicus, Vasco da Gamas, Amerigo Vespucci's, all these were voyagers, seafarers who were trying to go around the world discovering new lands. And new lands were discovered, new sea routes were discovered. And these overseas territories were converted into colonies by these European powers. A handful of countries based in Europe, which is now industrially advanced, began to expand outwards, establishing overseas empires and colonies. So the world began to witness colonization. So colonization and colonialism also began to gather momentum now. Why? Because industrial revolution requires new territories and raw materials and markets. And that led to the age of discoveries. Voyages were undertaken. Please remember that there is a logic in the way the world had progressed. There is a reason for everything which has occurred. Why was it that in the closing years of the 15th century, Vasco da Gama had to discover the sea route to India? Because they wanted raw materials. Okay? Actually, the Western countries, the Europeans, they were hearing tales and fables about a rich land called India. In the eastern part of the world, there is a land called India. And a lot of these voyagers were wanting to discover India. Including Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus set across the Atlantic Ocean trying to discover India. But instead he discovered West Indies and America. But he thought that was India. But that was not India. Okay. So, these European nations, they began to radiate outwards. They began to expand outwards. They began to occupy territories. That led to colonization. So please remember, capitalism, which was still now a boon, began to show its darker sides, its ugly side. Capitalism now began to plunder these newly discovered territories. Countries like India, countries like China, all these newly discovered territories were now being exploited by these capitalists. So capitalism had its darker side, which slowly began to reveal itself as industrial revolution is reaching its climax. Are you with me? Okay. Now this is colonization, the beginnings of colonization. What do you mean by colonization? Colonization simply means occupying a space. That's the meaning of colonization. It's a term which has got a very wide usage in biology, in economy, even in politics also. In political science, colonization represents occupying overseas territories through political subjugation or invasion to convert the region into a subordinate trading or economic partner. That's the meaning of colonization. So countries were being colonized. A handful of European countries: Portuguese, Dutch, the Spanish, the French, English, the Russians, the Austrians, Italians, some countries in Europe, a handful of countries in Europe, they began to colonize the entire world. The entire North America was colonized. Mexico, US, the present US, Canada, they were colonized. The entire South American continent was colonized. The entire Middle East was colonized. Central Asia was colonized. South Asia was colonized. Southeast Asia was colonized. The entire African continent was colonized. Far East was colonized. Micronesia was colonized. Polynesia was colonized. Australia, New Zealand, small islands kuda vadalledu. They colonized the entire world. Sri Lanka enta untadi. Even Sri Lanka also was not left. Fiji. Have you heard an island called Fiji? Fiji. Cape Verde. There is a country called Cape Verde. You know how many people that country has today, as of now? It has 5 lakhs people today, as of now. A small island in the Caribbean islands group of nations. A very small island. Now it has only 5 lakh people. You know how I came to know about this country? This country recently it qualified for the World Cup. FIFA Football World Cup. A country with 5 lakhs population has qualified for the World Cup. India. How many lakhs of population we have? 140 crores. So 100 lakhs of population we have, and we didn't qualify for FIFA World Cup. A small country, even Cape Verde, also was colonized by France. Small islands, Fiji. If you have to look at Fiji in the world map, you'll have to, expand it in the Google to find where it is. A very, very small island, a speck. You don't even find it in the world map also. A small speck of an island, even that also was colonized. The entire world was colonized by the European powers. The power of capitalism. Capitalism, therefore, led to imperialism. It led to conquest. It led to exploitation. It led to subjugation. All these were outcomes of capitalism. Okay? So that was what was going on. In the modern age, liberalism was an ideology. The age of Enlightenment. People began to adopt scientific principles. Technology was born. Mechanized production began. The world witnessed unprecedented growth. Capitalism, as a dominant economic mode of production, began to expand. This is capitalism in its international aspect. Okay? Suddenly, by the early years of the 20th century, these European nations began to quarrel among themselves. Ultimately, it led to the First World War. Why? Why did the First World War take place? In the first decade of the 20th century itself, rivalries, enmities, animosities, and conflicts began to erupt, culminating in the First World War. Why do you think did the First World War take place? Any idea?
Because of Germany and Spain.
Okay.
Spain.
No, Austrian. Yeah, very good. That actually is the spark. It's immediate cause. Yeah, you know that. The murder of Archduke Ferdinand, the heir apparent, ante enti kaboye raju, the heir apparent to Austrian throne, was the spark or the immediate cause, as she has mentioned, for the outbreak of the First World War. There must be some underlying reason which led to such a great conflict, isn't it? What must be the underlying cause? This was what is actually the cause for the First World War. The First World War was an outcome of security dilemma. Security dilemma caused by mutual rivalries, sparked by race for colonies. This was the reason. The European countries were in a race for acquiring more and more colonies. And this race for colonies led to rivalries. And those rivalries led to security dilemma, leading to the outbreak of the First World War. Okay, we'll discuss all these concepts later. But just remember, the trigger was the murder of Archduke Ferdinand, but the motive was to acquire more and more colonies. Race for colonies was the primary reason for the outbreak of the First World War. There were some countries which are ahead in their colonies. Can you tell me the countries that were ahead in colonies? Which was the country which was called as the Queen of the Seas at that time? England. England was having the world's largest empire. The sun never sets on the English empire. You know, there is this very famous saying. Why is it said so? Because the English empire was so vast geographically that at one point of the empire, if there was sunrise, at the other point of the empire, there was sunset. Okay? And before the sunset again, there used to be sunrise. There was such a vast stretch of empire created by an imperialist power called England. So England was having the world's largest empire. France was having a very, very large empire. Portuguese was having a very large empire. You know, these countries had stretched themselves and created huge empires. But there were some countries which are behind. Germany, Austria, Turkey, they were behind. Therefore, these countries formed an alliance, and those countries which are ahead in colonies, they formed another alliance. And there was a conflict between the two military alliances, and that was the First World War. So please remember, capitalism had given the world a world war also. A big conflict, you know. So that was the evil side of capitalism. The First World War came to an end. Finally, peace was settled through what was very famously called as the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles had created a new condition for peace. And slowly, the world again settled back into an uneasy peace. Okay? But of course, rivalries were still intact. Hostilities were still there. The wounds were still fresh. An effort was created to establish a global body called the League of Nations. To try and maintain peace. Okay? Capitalism was still the most dominant ideology, but now the evil side of the capitalist mode of production began to be seen outwards. Capitalism had created rivalries. Capitalism had led to colonization. Capitalism had led to exploitation of workers. Capitalism had created inequalities. Some people acquiring more and more wealth. Other people being deprived of share in development and fruits of their own labor. Capitalism was creating inequalities, exploitation, wars and conflicts. Capitalism was creating trade cycles. So people were getting more and more disillusioned by capitalism. Till this time, capitalism was considered the best way to organize production. Isn't it? There is a natural order of things, even in economy also. The people know their needs, so the people will create demand. And what will the companies do? The companies, in search of profits, because individuals are always guided by self-interests. So companies, in search of profits, will supply The supply of goods and services will take place in the most efficient manner because capitalism is based on the principle of competition. Competition. Unfair practices will be there. Capitalism began to show all these things. Unfair trade practices, monopolies, trade cycles, economic depressions, economic upheavals. All these things began to be shown by capitalism. All the claims of capitalism. People will demand what they need. Companies will supply. The companies will make profits. The profits of the companies will become investments. Companies will expand. More and more employment will be created. People's standards of living and incomes will rise. Everything is nice on paper. But in reality, capitalism had begun to show the evil side as well. Unfair trade practices, monopolies, crony capitalism, aggrandizement, imperialism, wars, exploitation, inequalities. Capitalism was now seriously being questioned. One person erupted onto the scene. He came out with a very cogent and a very damning criticism of capitalism. Who is that? Karl Marx. Capitalism had met its match in Karl Marx. Karl Marx came out with a very, very strong criticism of capitalism. He declared, capitalism is an ideology which is born pregnant with the seeds of its own destruction. Capitalism is an economic system full of contradictions. It is going to come down crumbling on the weight of its own contradictions. Capitalism is an ideology which will fail not only the working classes, even the capitalists themselves. Capitalism is an ideology which is bound to fail, according to Karl Marx. And Karl Marx proposed another ideology. He lent a great support to an alternative model of production, which is called as socialism. A new and an alternative model of production called socialism. I told you, if you remember, capitalism supports private ownership. Socialism supports common or collective ownership. Now, Karl Marx put forward a very fundamental question. The question was this: why is production organized in capitalism? Why? For what? When I was doing my post-graduation in political science and international relations, one day, our sir, one of the professors in the university, he was about to take a lecture. He asked two students to come to his room. There was a big board, a very, very big board. He asked the students to carry the board to the class. The board was brought to the class. And on the board, a lot of advertisements were stuck at various places. Advertisements, which figured in newspapers and magazines. వాటిని నీట్గా కట్ చేసి వాటిని ఆ బోర్డు మీద అంటించి క్లాస్ రూమ్లోకి తెచ్చాడు. That big board, consisting of all those paper cuttings of advertisements. Okay. Then he was asking us, each one of us, see, there are a lot of products which are being advertised in the newspapers and in the magazines. Okay. Now you tell me whether you need these products or not. Okay. There was one product there saying, live life king size, gold flak cigarettes. What's the use? Do you really live a life size, a king size life by smoking a cigarette? You don't. That's an advertisement. Taste the thunder, thumbs up. It is just a sugared carbonated water which is very, very harmful for your health. You know that? Right. The ultimate choice, the officer's choice, whiskey. All these were advertisements that were stuck on the board. He bought that and said, see, this is capitalism. Production in capitalism is organized only for the sake of profits. Profits are the driving forces of capitalist production. Profits. The goods are produced which give profits to the entrepreneurs. And if you don't buy those goods, they will induce you to buy those goods through these advertisements. Capitalism creates its own markets. Capitalism creates people's needs. You know, we probably might even not know whether we want it or not. There was a friend of mine who was having an iPhone, Apple phone. I asked him, what is so special about this phone? Why did you buy this? He said, don't ask me all that. You know why I bought it? When I am talking over this, somebody should see that Apple sign on my phone. That's the only reason I bought this phone. He doesn't even know why he bought it. Needs are manufactured in capitalism. This is capitalist mode of production. This is capitalism. According to Karl Marx, production under conditions of capitalism does not take place for the sake of social needs. It takes place for the sake of profits. This is an irrational mode of production. It is not rational. It is irrational mode of production. Karl Marx came out with a very, very strong criticism of capitalism. Socialism, because of the impetus of Marxist thought, began to become very, very popular. Socialism began to capture imagination of the people, particularly the young minds, the youthful minds. They began to get attracted towards socialism. Please remember, in the interwar period between the First and the Second World War, interwar period between the First and the Second World War, socialist ideology began to spread, began to make inroads into every country, into every university. They were socialists in Department of History. They were socialists in Economics Department. They were socialists in Political Science Department. They were socialists in Public Administration. There is a bureaucratic Marxist theory of bureaucracy. You know, socialists became part of every known discipline. Sociology, anthropology, economics, political science, public, you name it. They were socialists, they were Marxists everywhere. There is a separate approach called Marxist approach. It started to be developed. Marxist literature, Marxist poetry, even Marxist paintings also had come about, you know. Marxism began to spread its tentacles in every aspect of academic life in universities. Marxism began to become very, very popular in the interwar period. Capitalism began to face its first crisis. Its first crisis. Capitalism began to face its first crisis. It was about this time only, in 1920s, that America emerged as the world's largest economy. And America suddenly realized that it has a power that it can use. The power of trade. America began to impose tariffs, you know, just like Donald Trump is now imposing tariffs on other countries, isn't it? India, 100% tariff. This country, 200% tariff. That country, 150% tariffs, you know. Donald Trump is imposing tariffs on other countries. Why? To discourage the exports from that country into America. Right? So to discourage exports, America is imposing tariffs. So America began to use trade as a geopolitical weapon against other countries. Okay? So trade was getting disrupted. Capitalism, as I told you, established economic relations between various countries. Capitalism established supply chains. From one part of the world, they used to get raw materials. They used to produce here. They used to supply it to markets elsewhere. So capitalism had created some supply chains, but this trade between countries was being disrupted in the interwar period in 1920s. That ultimately led to a severe economic crisis called the Great Economic Depression. Which year? 1929. In 1929-30, the world witnessed the Great Economic Depression. Okay. Now this was a creation of capitalism. A creation of capitalism. This was a paradoxical situation. The market was flooded with goods. All kinds of goods were there in the markets. But there was no demand. People had no purchasing power to buy these goods. I told you that capitalism creates prosperity along with poverty. Capitalism concentrates wealth. Capitalism creates inequalities. You know, people were not having sufficient money to purchase these goods. So there was no offtake from the markets. So what happens if the demand falls? The companies will stop their supply. It means the companies will stop their production. What happens if the production is stopped? People will lose their jobs, isn't it? So more and more unemployment, more and more frustration, more and more desperation. Companies were locking up, people were being thrown out of their jobs, demand was plummeting, and market was flooded with goods, but there were no purchasers. This was called poverty amidst plenty. There was plentiful production of goods, but there was poverty among the people. The people could not buy these goods. Companies were closed. All the economic activities came to a standstill. So capitalism showed that it has a very, very serious problem. Okay? There was one political economist who gave a solution to the Great Economic Depression of 1929. Can you tell me what his name was? He is called the father of macroeconomics. J.M. Keynes. John Maynard Keynes. He suggested that the state should not be a mute spectator. The state should play a proactive role in macroeconomic management. Proper fiscal policies, proper monetary policies, so that the market fluctuations can be overcome. Price instability can be overcome. The state should try to give impetus to the market. State should try to kickstart the economy. State should try to stimulate the production process. You know, how should the state do this? Very simple. Spend money. Public spending. Dig holes. Make the people dig holes. Give them salary for doing that. Make the people fill the holes again. Give them money for that. Give money to people by spending. The government should start spending money. Now this is, even now also, whenever there is economic stagnation or recession in the economy, the government will declare what are called as stimulus packages. What will the government do to these stimulus packages is, the government will start aggressively spending money. That money will go to the people will start buying goods, demand will increase, companies will start producing. Simple, you know. So state should engage in macroeconomic management. The state should ensure price stability, currency stability, and state should intervene in economy to help economy revive or restart or kickstart. You know, that was the idea expressed by John Maynard Keynes. Okay, so capitalism was facing its crisis after crisis, and socialism was becoming very popular. Okay, it was during this time in 1930s that the conditions in Europe were leading to another severe crisis and conflict, culminating in the Second World War. Can you tell me why do you think the Second World War had taken place? Why?
France wants to take revenge.
France or Germany?
Germany.
Okay. Yeah, of course. That's always there. The insult and the humility meted out to the Germans led to the meteoric rise of a 5-foot dynamite called Adolf Hitler. Hitler raked up aggressive nationalism. Of course, that's probably a very big factor which determined the beginning and the course of the war, but there were more serious rivalries between countries. Please remember, this is the 20th century, isn't it? The 19th century. The 20th century. We are living in the 21st century. Please remember, in 19th century, wars were fought between countries for nationalism. You know, after the nation states were formed, we saw the unification of Italy, unification of Germany. We saw these countries forming based on national identities. But again, we also saw rivalries breaking out between these countries because of race for colonies. Therefore, primarily wars in the 19th century were for nationalism. Nationalism was the sentiment which drove people into wars. You know, the Germans, the Italians, the French, the English, the Americans. 19th century. 20th century was called the age of ideologies. Major wars in 20th century were fought for the purpose of ideology. You know, socialism, communism, fascism, Nazism. You know, Germany propagated a new ideology called Nazism. Italy propagated a new ideology called fascism. Soviet Union was formed, which was a communist state, communism. America, England, France, they were liberals. They adopted liberalism. They were liberal Western democracies. So countries were divided among themselves based on ideologies. Therefore, 20th century witnessed wars for the sake of ideologies. Okay? Right? 21st century, the present century. Are we fighting for ideology? Are the wars being fought for the sake of ideology today? You know? The 21st century wars were described by a political scientist as clash of civilizations. Clash of civilizations. Western liberal civilization and its values. Oriental values. For example, China. We have a dictatorship. You have a democracy. Our civilization is based on the concept of communitarianism. In our civilization, rights, political rights are not important. Duties are more important. We have a completely different set of values which we derive from our civilization. This they call as the Oriental civilization. The Western societies, they are completely committed to their own civilizational values like liberalism, rights, and democracy. You know, China is saying, we have dictatorship. That's our model. It's a part of our civilizational ethos, cultural values. Our societies are different. Our thinking is different. You know, Samuel P. Huntington says that the 21st century is going to witness clash of civilizations. 20th century witnessed the conflict of ideologies. The 19th century witnessed the wars for nationalism. So completely three different reasons as to why countries conflicted amongst themselves. Each century witnessed its own unique type of conflict and cause for war. This is the 21st century. You know, in the 20th century, in the interwar period, we saw different types of ideologies sweeping across Europe. We saw Nazism in Germany. We saw fascism in Italy. We saw liberalism and liberal democracy in several countries like France, England, America. We saw rise of communism in Soviet Union. We saw Gaullism as an ideology that became very, very prominent in some countries in Europe. We saw Salazarism, that was another ideology that became very prominent in Portugal. A lot of countries in Europe began to witness different types of ideologies. People were confused. Too many ideologies. Okay? It was at this time that two prominent ideologies began to conflict with each other. Right? You tell me, why did the Second World War break out? Don't tell me it's just because somebody had insulted Germany that a world war had taken place. Why did the Second World War take place at all? Any idea? The cause for the outbreak of the Second World War. Think about it and let me know tomorrow. Okay?